You're listening to The Outcue, a 21 News journalist perspective on a top news story.
Good afternoon. It is Friday, December 20th, and this is part one of a two-part Outcue looking back on the year that was exhausting. I'm Assistant News Director Justin Mitchell. With me for the first part of this is Senior Digital Content Manager Robert McFerren. And what we're going to do is a little different this time. We're going to do this week just talking about all of the stories that you're not going to even remember happened this year because it seems like some of these are so old, but it was just that busy of a news year. And then we're going to come back next week with a few of our reporters talking about their most memorable stories they've covered this year. Because, Robert, it has been, we knew it was a busy one, but when you start going through the stories,
it's amazing that some of these stories were just a few months ago. In some cases, we're like, wait, that just was a few months. I mean, because literally, there wasn't a slow month this year. I mean, in some years you have like, wow, it's slow. What didn't happen this
the
year.
periods that we thought were slow were just, they were busy following up on the last big thing until the next big thing happened. And some good and some bad. It's not all bad news, but there has been a fair share of pretty monumental news. And you know, unfortunately in this business, you do deal with a lot of things that are not pleasant. Yeah. But let's, just to go to the tail of the tape, sort of. So in January, right off the bat, let's see. January 9th, Girard School's treasurer secures raise for grant success, state auditors to examine its legality. Now, this was January 9th. This is where we learned from a state audit that the treasurer of the Girard City Schools had secured a subtle change in his contract language.
Seemed minor.
It was the difference between, and I don't remember the exact figures right now, but it was like, you could get a percentage of every grant that you brought in, and it became a percentage of everything that the district made.
Right.
So it went from 2.5 to 1.
Seems like they're going to save money and be good stewards of the taxpayers'
It was $500,000 that this guy got paid in 1 year. I believe, I can't say for sure, but I believe the highest paid treasurer in the country.
For a school district, yeah.
And the board wasn't even entirely sure how that had happened. Yeah. They all seemed to believe that there was a cost savings, and that's what the audit that caught this unveiled. We had this story because I've said this before many times. We do diligently read these audits, which are very painstaking to go through. But every now and then, there's something that the public needs to know.
Right, and in this case, we hadn't been alerted to this. You found it looking at an audit and went through it and like, hey, what is this?
We started calling board members. I couldn't believe I read the numbers right. It was so outrageous.
Right, yeah.
That sets the tone for the year, that we're going to be uncovering things everywhere that we can. It's just 2 days after this that this is a story that bled into, it was started last year and then came into this year, is the story of a woman named Brittany Watts. You remember her?
Oh, yeah.
That was this year too.
Became a national story. Yeah.
Became a national story. This was a woman who had a miscarriage in Warren. And in the uncertainty following the overturning of Roe v. Wade, police, the hospital, people weren't sure how they were supposed to handle this because of the way she had disposed. She had a miscarriage at home. Yep. And so she was initially charged with abuse of a corpse.
Yep.
So what happened at the beginning of this year was that the prosecutor's office and the grand jury declined to charge her, and hundreds of people rallied in support of her, and she spoke out and talked about being a voice. And that was this local story that had national ripple effects. She was invited to the State of the Union, I believe.
She was, yes.
Robert printed these for me, and I just want to show you guys that this stack here is front and back. So,
and these are just the highlights.
I tell you that because we're not going to touch on it. You're going to hear something and go, I can't believe they didn't talk about yeah, because we ran out of time because it was that busy.
And we will have these on the website, so check back on, WFMJ.com beginning tomorrow. We'll start month by month, and you can look at them all.
So here's another one that started the year before and fed in, and you can tell them about this one. This is where we found out that the FBI was raiding QuickMed and the Youngstown City Schools on the same day.
Yeah, kind of a big thing for us because we had reported on, allegations of misspent money, questionable spending in the school district. There was questions about that involved QuickMed and the contracts with the school district. We knew the FBI was in town looking at these things. And then we get, the call that, hey, there's like SUVs, at the school, and there's SUVs at, QuickMed facilities. What's going on? Well, we quickly found out, that they were there visiting and taking computers and files and things out as part of an investigation that they're looking at, and it's, to our knowledge, still going on.
And they have all but acknowledged that, yes, it's all related.
Yes.
Because you can't make that assumption.
No.
They've essentially acknowledged that, and they have said there's an ongoing investigation, but, we'll be talking about this into the next year, most likely,
Yep.
because it's either going nowhere eventually or something's going to pop.
Yep.
And that happens every day. It's talk about skipping big stories. I'm not even going to talk about the fact that Bill Johnson stepped down from Congress and became YSU president. That was mostly a 2023 story, but it really officially happened this year. With a Warren police officer indicted for rape. And then more. And then more. So superseding indictments. At one point, a prosecutor called him, Michael Edwards Jr., called him possibly the most prolific serial rapist in Trumbull County history. That was what the prosecutor said at the time. That one didn't entirely stick. He was convicted, but he wasn't convicted on everything.
Right.
And that became a fascinating case to follow because of the legal arguments being made. Basically, the accusation is that he was preying on people who had been in some legal trouble.
Right.
At least one, I believe, had been charged with prostitution in the past. And the trouble is that the defense's argument was that, it was unprofessional. He shouldn't have been having sex on duty, but it was consensual. And it's hard to disprove that sometimes. There's a lot that could be said about the legalities of it. I am trying to keep it brief because there's so many to get through, and we're still in January, and we're 5 minutes in, so we gotta. I don't want to just have me name some of these. So if you remember any, or that there's some you want to bring up too,
go ahead, month by month, because I don't have them in front of me. So if
you want to,
I know, that's all you.
It was February 1st that Steward Health was called out on Capitol Hill for their financial woes. February 1st.
Seems like we've been covering Stewart for years now, but it's not. It's been all in this year that, there's a problem. They're closing. There's a bankruptcy filing. We just don't know what's going to happen, with the local hospitals here. Here we are today, still not knowing what's going on over in PA.
And this was on Capitol Hill because this was never just a local story. Steward was, headed towards and eventually in bankruptcy everywhere. So our community story in both Warren and in Sharon, it's just a microcosm of what communities across the country are going through with this healthcare giant and the threat of losing anchor hospitals.
Yeah, because this kind of kicked off like in Boston leading with this, a lot of the big, larger Boston hospitals, but then it impacted everybody eventually. And
so that led up ultimately to them filing bankruptcy, filing notices of closure, a group forming to try and save the Warren hospitals, that group then not being successful and disbanding.
And it was complicated because it was just not a hospital. They had another group that was part of them that also owned the buildings that released it then to the hospital facility. So it was a lot to explain to people of what's really going on here.
And it's a lot to understand yourself.
Yes.
I still would not consider any of us experts on the healthcare industry, but I understand more about what Steward's going through now than I ever did before. This is hours on the phone, in off hours. There was, know that she's been a bit of a lightning rod in some other areas, but Nikki Frenchko in Trumbull County understood these issues really, really in depth in ways that not everybody did. So I spent a lot of time talking to her about concerns with Insight and concerns with Insight being the hospital system that took over, and MPT and who was connected to who. And she was getting info from a woman named Mo Tosic, who works for the American Prospect and has been following Stewart on a national level. Deep dive stuff, but it all started with a congressional hearing that seemed like, you throw it in the newscast, people care, but there's no direct local impact, right?
And sitting and listening, to court hearings, this was taking place in Dallas. We're sitting here, us and other staff members all took our turns listening to these endless court cases where sometimes something major happens, sometimes you'd listen for 3 hours and nothing happened.
And they're difficult to follow because, like we said, this is a national case. So a couple things about bankruptcy court or anything in federal court is that you cannot have cameras and you're not allowed to record it. But you are allowed to listen in. Or if it's something physically that you can go to, you're allowed to sit in. But you better be good at taking notes because there's nobody to ask questions. What did he just say? And there's nothing to play back.
Who's talking? Who's he representing? What party is? What's their interest in this? What's their involvement in it? And you better.
And it's audio.
And
it's audio.
So you're taking notes as fast as you can go. I'm going to figure this out as we go along.
Because they don't introduce themselves every single time they speak. And you're talking everybody who's a player across the country in the Stewart bankruptcy.
So then you should learn even voices. Like, okay, that's that guy. I recognize his voice,
Yes, and a little bit of a shout out to that judge because he did explain a lot of what he was doing and what he was saying and why, which was very helpful. It kept everybody on course. The Ohio EPA issued its permit to Sobe Thermal Energy Systems on February 15th.
Another one that seems like it's been going on for a long time.
And will go on for a long time still. That was shortly thereafter. The city of Youngstown put a moratorium in place, which they have just recently put back on to try and get another year of moratorium while they study this issue. The mayor just got an award 2 days ago for fighting the Sobe energy project because of concerns over whether or not it's safe. But at the same time, the EPA just this week, what do?
They said it's all a go, move forward.
In secret.
The
process is a trade secret.
So it's, we're not allowed to share what we approved. We got it. It's page after page of redacted information that's trade secret, so we don't really know what's happening there. They're saying, well, trust us.
And I bring that up because as we go through all of these stories quickly and all of this stuff that's been covered, more questions arise. We still have questions. We're going to keep, this is going to be a story for years to come. Here's one that went on for several years and came to its culmination finally to, I think, the relief of a lot of people involved, which is that the one defendant in the murder of Rowan Sweeney that did go to trial went to trial and was convicted on February 15th. Now, this was, number one, it was a story that we were covering for years with there was a gag order in the case, so there were details that we couldn't just call somebody and ask about, so you had to wait in between hearings. We also had a young reporter who'd never covered a trial, cover this gavel to gavel, Leslie Huff, who learned a lot and would come back every day and make me proud because, I would be listening and I'd say, okay, well, I know what's important. So let's go caucus. And every day she'd tell me, well, I think what was important was, and it would match what I thought was important. But Brandon Crump was found guilty, and it was a fascinating trial because it looked for a long way like there could have been reasonable doubt as to who pulled the trigger, and that could have jeopardized the entire case.
We had multiple suspects, multiple people that were there when this happened, but yet all of a sudden there was question of,
I think ultimately because they were all charged with aggravated murder and there was evidence showing Crump bragging about the money from the crime scene, I think what ultimately led to the conviction was it didn't matter if he pulled the trigger. When you're an accomplice in a crime that leads to somebody being killed, you can be convicted of aggravated murder. And so I would imagine, and you don't know what's in a juror's mind, but I got the impression, and certainly me in the court of public opinion watching it, I started listening to the defense thinking they're poking holes through this case. And then there was enough evidence where I never was completely convinced I knew who pulled the trigger, but I was convinced they were all involved, and it did result in this death in the course of a crime.
Yep.
So here's the very first Outcue was back in
February 23rd?
It was February. How the hell? Yes, February 23rd. And it focused on Vienna Township's finances after the auditor's office had to swoop in and say there's missing money. There's tons of missing money here. We don't know what happened to it.
Story we're still covering.
Story we're still covering, but subsequently the fiscal officer has been indicted. Yeah. And they just, actually, I think they're going to vote to formally approve next week a plan to come out of fiscal emergency. But this led to layoffs of police and fire.
All essential services were harmed by this. Police, fire, emergency services.
And there was a lot of confusion sorting through that also, because if the fiscal officer is to be believed, and I say is because she's not convicted of anything yet, so even though right now the law is pointing the finger at her, that could change. But her contention was that there was an abuse of overtime in several departments, and she provided documentation that backed that up, which left us with the question, if somebody's lying.
Right.
These are either doctored documents or somebody else is doctoring documents, but somewhere there's documentation that shows where the money went that's not right.
Yep.
So that'll all be sorted through. But that's one we've been following.
Very interesting.
Back to the Youngstown City Schools. A dean of students charged with domestic violence after very chilling video comes out.
Was very upsetting, yeah.
So talk about that one.
We got a tip, that happened on a Friday night late, and like 1, 2 in the morning, I believe. It was late.
Something like that, definitely middle of the night.
Phone rang early Saturday morning saying, here's what you need to look for. And we found it quickly that, there had been an arrest, and eventually got the video sent to us, and we couldn't even air the video. It was disturbing.
It depicted a man named Shevis Whipple who was in an argument with his daughter over her not being where he thought she should be. Right. But you could see him dent a car with her head, among other things. It was very hard to watch. Yeah. And, in this business, we've got to watch these things actually a lot of times over to determine what is and isn't okay for air. And we ultimately made the decision that there was just no way to show this video that wasn't too graphic. Yeah. But we could describe it and make sure that people didn't think that this was just a matter of simple discipline.
Yeah, because that's what it was kind of being presented. It seemed to be, that I'm disciplining a daughter, but there's a point of what's defining discipline.
And so that case ultimately did finally wrap up after some last minute surprise drama where he was on trial and a mistrial was declared.
There was a mistrial,
And it was over somebody saying something outside of the scope of what they'd agreed would be testified to. And then he ultimately entered into a plea deal. And I don't remember exactly the terms of it, but I know that he lost his job at the Youngstown schools.
He did lose his job, yes.
And I don't believe there was jail time, but there was probation. And just an unfortunate, an unfortunate case. March 4th, or I'm sorry, a little before March 4th, but this was when the 911 call came out. March 2nd, mail carrier John Tate Davis is murdered in broad daylight in Warren.
Yep.
I'll be honest with you, this one, I remember this, like the details of the case, and not a lot about that day that it happened. I don't know if was I off maybe with the day it happened?
I don't remember.
Doesn't matter about me, but I just don't remember how it went down in the newsroom.
Yeah, I remember that, there was a lot of discussion of, why, there's a mailman on the street doing his job and he's shot and killed. Well, we'd already reported previously that there had been other incidents in the area with people robbing postal people to get the master key to open boxes where people's checks and other valuables were sent through the mail.
And I don't know if we know for sure that was the motive.
I don't know that we know the motive, no, but it was one of those that...
But subsequently, we do have 2 suspects that have been indicted federally because this was a mail carrier, and so this is a federal offense. And just today we reported on one of them who had wanted to be released on bond, and the judge denied it, saying that the severity of the accusations as well as the potential for a flight risk.
took a long time to get suspects. I mean, because there was one that we were wondering how, in this day and age with cameras everywhere, how does somebody shoot somebody during the daylight hours on a busy street
And I suspect that had something to do with the feds taking over the case.
I assume, yes.
The thing about federal investigations is that they move slower,
But they're thorough.
they're very meticulous.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
They don't. They have a very high conviction rate,
Yes.
and they have a lot of. When they finally put detail out there,
Yeah.
I mean, every line of the document will have something new in it. March 16th, we report that, and this is another one that spreads over years. We had in 2023 reported on all of the questionable spending in the Youngstown City School District, which culminates in the board announcing that there will have to be cuts and budget reductions because they've got a major projected deficit that a few years out was, I think, approaching
26 million?
something like that, 26, 27 million.
Somewhere in that neighborhood, I believe. Off
And-
the top of my head, yes.
And so that's something they're still working through.
Yeah.
They have made progress. They've made actually substantial progress in coming back from that financially, but it's still there. It's going to be
Right.
something that district crawls out from for a long, long time.
And this was obviously after having the COVID years where they received $78 million in federal funds to assist this district that we reported on. That several of the attempts were wasted.
Right, and that's why this was particularly significant. A district struggling is always news, but it's not uncommon. But it was particularly noteworthy here because they had gotten such a large amount of money.
yeah.
And not that it can all be used for exactly the same purposes, but there's allocations so that if it's used here, it doesn't have to be used here, so that whatever the COVID money could be used for can alleviate where you have to spend it out of your general fund.
Yes.
So if you end up facing a deficit, you would hope as a resident of the city or a taxpayer or a parent that you're not going to be able to point to millions of dollars that went to things that didn't come to fruition. And that was the case in Youngstown.
Yes, it was.
We're almost 20 minutes in and we're only to April, so I'm going to start hitting only the major highlights. Let's just talk about May real quickly here. Let's see. Yeah,
May.
let me just name everything that
May.
happened in May. May 7th, Stewart Healthcare puts all of their hospitals up for sale, including the locations in the Valley. That's May 7th. May 15th, Eastern Gateway College announces it's going to completely dissolve after years of questionable financial trouble. May 23rd, the US EPA and the Department of Justice announce a settlement with Norfolk Southern and some, at least cosmetic, rail safety changes.
All huge stories.
All huge stories.
And then?
On May 28th, an explosion in downtown Youngstown, and one's killed, several are injured. The Realty building becomes the story of the year in a year full of big stories. I mean, we're 20 minutes in and we've just now mentioned the Realty building.
Yeah, I mean, and the impact of that story, again, another one that went national, that building exploding, and a pipeline was cut, that was thought to be dormant or non-active and led to an explosion, but, killed people. And it's not uncommon. This happens, and we did our 101 West where we looked into how this is not an uncommon thing that happens.
No, and so that fills up a lot of really the rest of the year. There are still big stories that happen, but what we have to do a lot of is a lot of looking into, and you know what, I just want to correct something because the Gerard Treasurer thing, the audit that caught the overpayment actually didn't come out until May. It was an earlier question about this previous contract that also was unusual that we had done earlier in the year. I just am looking at that. Just a quick correction there. But so from the Realty explosion, you mentioned the 101 West report we did on gas pipelines and the fact that these explosions are not uncommon. We also found in just the continuing coverage of this that it was the city of Youngstown that had ordered and paid for the work that was being done.
Yes.
That was months worth of questions
Yes.
as to why and who was doing the work.
Right.
We finally got the mayor to admit that he was okay with Greenheart, But if they subcontracted, he had no idea who was doing the work. And to this day, we don't officially know who was doing the work that cut that line.
Yeah.
Another huge story is these residents. We find out that even though they're not allowed to get their personal items out, what did we find out?
We found out that they were going out the building anyhow, and we had photos that were sent to us of people that were dressed in construction worker clothes hauling personal items out of there, large computers, TVs. We saw lots of items going out of the building on the photos.
And then we find out that they were the crews working on the building.
And they had a contract that said
had a contract
that said, if you're taking the building down, anything inside of it's yours.
And the city approved that contract, correct?
Yes. They did.
And their logic was, this is all either headed to a landfill, or we can have it.
Right. So the tenants couldn't go in there safely, but others could. And unfortunately, it was.
Now, once this became an issue, the city pretty vehemently spoke out against it and demanded it not happen anymore. But we repeatedly tried to talk to this company. I mean, there's several days worth of video.
Having a reporter standing at the fence yelling, knowing their names, and saying, "Hey, will you talk with me?" And
watching them ignore us.
Yes. I mean, on the explosion, we also had an explosion later in the year that killed 4 people in Ellsworth Township. So it was another natural gas.
We think.
We think.
We don't know
There's
for sure what caused that one.
Right. But there was another deadly explosion.
That was, I mean, that's still actually getting ahead because I did circle that one too.
I'm just kind of putting that in while we're talking about
this. Yeah. I mean, that was just another one where, I mean, we had 2 deadly explosions of structures unrelated in every way except that they came out of nowhere and they bolster this assertion that we came to that this is not that uncommon.
No.
And it's underregulated and the regulations are like Swiss cheese. Yeah. And, not to editorialize, but you hear people talk about there being heavy regulation on industries. And when you start to examine the regulation, you often find that even if there's a lot of pages, there's not a lot of teeth sometimes.
I mean, on day one of that, I mean, we started looking like, well, who would approve the work to be done? There has to be a permit process. And we started looking into it and found that we went from local to county to state to federal. And suddenly, like, there doesn't seem to be, everyone kept saying, well, it's not us, but it's somebody else. And nobody knew.
Right. It seems as though everybody thinks that they don't have, it's not their responsibility, but they're not worried because it's someone else's responsibility.
Right. Someone else, and they just.
Often, in certain cases, not anybody's responsibility. June, we had Father Mike Swires from Hubbard. From St. Patrick in Hubbard.
Long-time priest.
Well-known, long-time priest. Yes. Well-known, well-beloved.
Yep.
And allegations involving conduct with minors, and I want to be careful how I say that because I know where people's brains go, and it wasn't.
No.
We're not talking anything that was, to my knowledge, criminal, and not anything that was like a priest sex abuse scandal. It was not that.
No, and these were old charges that were coming back,
and they were considered like inappropriate interactions as opposed to full-on abuse.
Yes.
But they still came out as a major surprise that led to his resignation, and then a report came out from the diocese that backed it all up, and I don't remember his exact status because I'm not well-versed on that, but he's not at the church. I know that.
No.
The last suspect in the murder of Chastity Broadstone, which was a story from early in 2023, was sentenced to life on aggravated murder and arson charges. This was a case in early 2023 where a house was burned down in a dispute over child support, and it killed a young girl. Really moving right along here, but there was another huge story in July, on July 3rd, when there were dismembered remains found in the Shenango Reservoir that turned out to be the remains of a young teenager named Polly Likens. Suspect was arrested. Some of the murder weapon was found. And this also becomes a national story.
Oh, yeah. Transgender teen that was just went missing, went out for a walk, and late at night, but then didn't come home. And we get reports of the FBI down at the river and
For days.
And we go down, like, what's going on? We know there's someone missing in the area, and they're searching the river for something. So,
and eventually they finally said that what this case was, and there were charges filed. But then even after that, the FBI has been back there for several days.
Yep, just last month or 2 months ago.
I don't even remember the timeline. And we don't know for sure why they were there. No. Obviously, the elephant in the room is, was it related to that case? And we really don't know that still. And all of these stories deserve, and have in many cases gotten, more than we're giving them right now. There's just simply not. We could sit here and do a year's worth of coverage. So I don't, just lest anybody think that we're rushing through. We sort of are, but that's to illustrate a point.
This was a busy news year.
July 15th, Donald Trump announces our senator as his running mate pick, J.D. Vance. Okay, we talked about realty. I think we're going to get to this one when we bring Caitlin up here, so I'm going to skip that for right now. August 7th, several massage parlors are raided in the Valley, including one that is owned by, at the time, a Hubbard Township trustee and now Trumbull County Commissioner-elect Rick Hernandez. Hernandez denies any involvement and says that this woman will be, the woman who runs this spa will be exonerated. An interesting position for him to take, because he's the landlord and he's not necessarily obligated to know anything. And he's certainly not obligated to defend her, but he has. He has not only said that he wasn't aware of any wrongdoing, he insists there is no wrongdoing and that this will be cleared up, and time will tell. We don't know. There have been charges filed from those raids. I don't believe any from that particular parlor.
Not that one, no.
Jump ahead. Alan Shaw from Norfolk Southern is out after an alleged inappropriate workplace relationship. You talk about in with a major flourish and out with a whimper.
He had come in just before the train derailment and had taken over and then gone.
We had a nurse attacked outside of Trumbull Regional Hospital. She was pregnant. She spoke to us from her hospital bed hours after delivering a child. She was doing much better at the time, but a suspect was arrested in that one subsequently, and that was a big deal. The warrant officer we talked about earlier was convicted of 2 of the counts of rape and other charges, was, I believe, acquitted on some others that they couldn't get past reasonable doubt. Another Trumbull County community has missing money. This time it's Bezetta. This is a weird one, right? I'm trying to help me out here if I'm forgetting any of the details, but so there's money due back from the auditor's office to the township as part of their local government fund allocations. And the Trumbull County auditor gets an email from an official email from the Bezetta fiscal officer. But it's not a legitimate email. It has misspellings in it, and there's a new bank, an online bank that they want the funds remitted to, which they are, over $80,000. It turns out that email had been hacked, and this was a mixture of a hack and a phishing scam, and now there's money missing. The Bezetta Township trustees have sued the auditor after several very, very heated public arguments over who's at fault here. And that's going to play on into the next year. They still, and in fact, what was it? I think just last week that Bezetta put out an update as to where their legal fees were.
It was just an update on here's a few more thousand we've had to spend in battling this case.
And they want that, and that's for a writ of mandamus, which is ordering a public official to do their job.
And they're keeping track of money we have to spend that we didn't want to.
Right. Another big one that I think one other outlet has finally gotten on to is that the Southern Park Mall is up for sale, may be sold to a group called Cohen Retail. And this happened very quietly. And the tax incentives that were given to Washington Prime to make investments in the mall are now passing on to the new owner regardless of what they do.
Because of the way that it was written at the time. It wasn't contingent that this was just a deal for Washington Prime. This is whoever owns this building.
And
it was one of those interesting ones that we followed that for a while. We had been tipped this was happening, but we couldn't get anyone to confirm it. Then finally, we finally got the paperwork that showed that they had sent letters out, to some of the larger retailers in the store of what the changes were going to be, and let us report what's going on there.
And the local officials were caught by surprise, particularly the Mahoning County commissioners, who were upset over the tax incentive. But we had to point out to them that they signed it.
Yeah,
they signed off on that deal.
And when something this big of an institution, you think that surely they've heard of this, but we were literally informing them of what was about to take place.
And so that's one that we're going to keep following. On October 5th was when the house exploded in Ellsworth that we already have discussed, and that killed 2 people and rattled a whole neighborhood, and that's still under investigation.
Wasn't it 4?
I'm sorry, 4 people.
4
2 people who lived there and 2 people
who were visiting.
4
yes.
people.
Yep.
Thank you. I was remembering the people who lived there.
Right, because we knew initially. Yes.
Just yesterday, we covered the sentencing for a man from Youngstown, Elias Godino, who was accused of executing 3 men from Youngstown in Akron.
Yep.
He claimed that it was they were cartel members that forced him into it. The jury wasn't buying it, I think in part because the address where he says the cartel made him go, these enemies of the cartel also happened to be his ex-wife and her new lover. And that didn't...
And he was found guilty.
Yeah, he was found guilty and he was sentenced yesterday. Former Vienna fiscal officer ends up indicted over the missing money, held on bond.
Yep.
Dean of students from Youngstown schools, we mentioned he was sentenced to house arrest, so I forgot about that. An 83-year-old robs a bank in Austintown, says he can't make ends meet, and didn't want to go to prison and didn't really want to rob the bank, but he spoke to us about the struggles.
And so again, it's one of those that you looked at it and just said, there's something odd. Why is this man who has no past record suddenly robbing a bank? There's more to this story. And you were right. And
what was more to the story was really just that it was a desperation move. There had to have been a desperation move there. That doesn't excuse the behavior, and I don't know how this will play out, but the attorneys are trying to get him into Veterans Court and some sort of diversion program because he has no history. That was just a compelling story. Couple others just to wrap up as quickly as we can here, because I didn't want to go more than 20 and we're 34 in, there was an investigation into alleged racism between the Youngstown fire chief and the fire union. It was not clear where that was going to lead, and ultimately the city decided that they felt enough was enough with the infighting, and they backed the fire chief unequivocally and essentially told everybody, you're going to need sensitivity training, professional development training, and everybody's going to have to start acting more professional. And still going on is what the future of Sharon Regional is, which we talked about Stewart earlier, and I'm not going to rehash that whole thing right now because that's a very complicated story that deserves its own half an hour.
Yes.
Anything I'm missing that you think we should have at least touched on?
It's just been one of those years that as we went through this list earlier, we're just saying, I can't believe this all was this year. There was a plane crash in Trumbull County that killed people, that's like, now it just seems like a blip of like, oh yeah, there was a plane crash here, and just like incidents all over the place. That
big news.
Yeah, that would in any normal news year would have been your top stories, and they're...
Going through this stack here, I was skipping stories that I would have thought were warranted their own discussion.
Yeah.
Okay, wrapping this first part up, because then next week we'll be back with a few of the most memorable stories from some of our reporters from this past year, and that'll be the final edition of the Outcue for the year. But until then, this has been the Outcue.